December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, near the Belgian town of Bastogne. The winter air bites with a cold that seeps through wool and leather, and the forest stands silent under a heavy gray sky. German soldiers advance through the snow-laden pines, their breath forming white clouds in the frozen morning. They are part of the Great Gamble, Hitler's final offensive in the West, the operation meant to split the Allied armies and drive to Antwerp, turning the tide of a war that has turned inexorably against the Reich. These men are veterans, survivors of the Eastern Front, and they have seen the worst that modern war can offer. They know Soviet Katyusha rockets. They know artillery barrages that turn forests into moonscapes. They know the sound of death arriving from the sky. But what they hear on this December morning is something different. It begins as a distant whooshing like wind through a narrow canyon, growing rapidly into a shriek that drowns out even the stammering of machine guns. Then the forest erupts. The earth itself seems to tear open as hundreds of rockets slam into the German positions in a span of seconds. Trees disintegrate into splinters, snow vaporizes into steam, men are thrown through the air like rag dolls, their screams lost in the overwhelming roar of high explosives detonating in rapid succession. And then, as suddenly as it began, silence returns. Smoke drifts through the shattered forest. The survivors, those few who remain conscious and unhurt, stagger to their feet, ears ringing, minds struggling to comprehend what has just occurred. One soldier, a young Obergefreiter named Klaus Steiner from Bavaria, crawls from beneath a fallen tree trunk and looks toward the direction from which the attack came. Through the smoke and snow, perhaps a kilometer distant, he glimpses something that makes no sense. Not tracked artillery pieces, not specialized military vehicles designed for war, but trucks. Common, ordinary trucks with simple frames mounted on their beds, now empty and silent, having delivered their payload of destruction before disappearing back into the Allied lines. Steiner would survive the Ardennes offensive and spend the remainder of the war as a prisoner. Years later, in his memoir published in the 1970s, he would write, "In that moment, seeing those trucks after such devastation, I understood that we had already lost, not because their rockets were better than ours, but because they could mount such weapons on vehicles you would use to deliver bread. They had so much of everything that they could afford to be casual with their killing." The weapon that so devastated German forces that winter morning was the M4A1 multiple rocket launcher, but American soldiers knew it by a different name, the Calliope. And in the months that followed, it would be joined by an even more fearsome sibling, the T-34 Calliope mounted on Sherman tanks, and most devastatingly, the M16 multiple-gun motor carriage and the truck-mounted systems that would come to define American rocket artillery, simple, pragmatic, and built on the chassis of vehicles designed to haul supplies, not deliver apocalyptic firepower. But the most symbolic of all was the truck-mounted system that German intelligence struggled to classify, rocket launchers bolted to the beds of GMC and Studebaker trucks, vehicles so ordinary, so utilitarian, that their transformation into instruments of mass destruction seemed to encapsulate everything the Wehrmacht had come to fear about American industrial power. The development of American rocket artillery followed a different path than its German or Soviet counterparts. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, it possessed virtually no rocket artillery capability. The Germans had their naval warfare systems, specialized tracked launchers that fired devastating barrages, but required significant logistical support and dedicated production lines. The Soviets had their Katyushas, truck-mounted rockets that had proven brutally effective, but were purpose-built military systems developed through years of testing and refinement. The Americans had nothing comparable. What they had instead was an industrial base of staggering capacity and a military culture that valued improvisation and pragmatic solutions over theoretical perfection. The story began in earnest in 1943, when American forces in North Africa and Italy began encountering German Nebelwerfer positions. The psychological impact of these weapons was profound. The distinctive shrieking sound of the rockets in flight, the saturation effect of multiple projectiles arriving simultaneously, the terror induced in troops caught in the open. American commanders requested equivalent capabilities, and the request filtered back to the Ordnance Department and to the research facilities at Aberdeen Proving Ground and the California Institute of Technology, where rocket research was already underway. But the American approach differed fundamentally from European doctrine. German and Soviet rocket artillery was conceived as specialized weapon systems, requiring dedicated manufacturing, specialized crews, and complex logistical chains. The Americans looked at the requirement differently. They had trucks, thousands upon thousands of trucks rolling off production lines at Ford, GMC, Studebaker, and dozens of other manufacturers. These trucks were already going to Europe by the shipload, already forming the backbone of American logistics. Why not mount rocket launchers on them? The concept was almost embarrassingly simple. Engineers designed frames and rails that could be bolted onto standard truck beds. The rockets themselves, 4.5-inch M8 rockets developed from aircraft munitions, were mounted in clusters. The launchers could be elevated and traversed manually. Aiming was rudimentary, more art than science. The entire system could be assembled by maintenance crews in the field using basic tools. There were no complex fire control systems, no sophisticated targeting mechanisms, no specialized components that required months to manufacture. It was rocket artillery reduced to its essential elements: a platform, a set of rails to guide the rockets, and a firing mechanism. The trucks themselves were utterly ordinary, the same vehicles that hauled ammunition, supplies, fuel, and troops. A GMC CCKW 2.5-ton cargo truck could be converted to carry rocket racks in a matter of hours and converted back just as quickly if needed. The first combat use came in Italy in late 1943, but it was in France and the Low Countries in 1944 that truck-mounted rocket artillery came into its own. The system proved devastatingly effective, not because of any technical sophistication, but because of the sheer volume of firepower it could deliver with minimal investment. A single truck carrying a full load of rockets could put dozens of projectiles on target in less than a minute. The rockets were not particularly accurate. Individual dispersion was measured in hundreds of meters. But accuracy was not the point. The system was designed for area saturation, for suppressing enemy positions, for disrupting concentrations of troops or armor, for psychological impact, and it excelled at all of these. German soldiers on the receiving end of these barrages struggled to reconcile the casual, almost careless deployment of such firepower with their own experience of war. In the German military, specialized weapon systems were precious, carefully husbanded, deployed only when the tactical situation demanded and when adequate preparation could ensure their effectiveness. The Nebelwerfer units were tracked, documented, their ammunition carefully rationed. Every barrage was planned, coordinated, authorized at division level or higher. The Americans seemed to scatter rockets like a farmer broadcasting seed. Truck-mounted launchers appeared everywhere, operated by ordinary artillery crews, sometimes by infantry units, occasionally by ad hoc teams who simply needed to put a lot of explosives on a target very quickly. The casualness of it, the fact that the launchers were mounted on vehicles designed for hauling cargo, that they could be set up in minutes and displaced just as rapidly, spoke to a kind of industrial abundance that German forces found increasingly demoralizing. One captured German intelligence report, dated February 1945 and recovered from the files of Wehrmacht High Command after the war, attempted to catalog American rocket artillery capabilities. The analyst, a major whose name was redacted, wrote with a tone that mixed professional assessment with barely concealed dismay. Enemy rocket artillery systems continue to proliferate beyond our ability to track distinct variants. New configurations appear weekly, some mounted on tanks, others on standard cargo vehicles. Common feature is improvisation. Enemy appears capable of mounting rocket launchers on virtually any platform. Manufacturing effort required appears minimal. Psychological effect on troops is severe. Recommend immediate development of counter-battery capabilities, though given enemies' ability to displace these systems rapidly, effectiveness of counter-battery fire is questionable. Assessment. Enemy has solved rocket artillery problem through industrial excess rather than technical refinement. They do not need sophisticated systems because they can deploy crude systems in overwhelming numbers. This approach is consistent with observed enemy strategic doctrine, emphasizing material superiority over tactical elegance. The report, clinical and precise in its language, captured the essence of what the truck-mounted rocket launchers represented. They were not elegant, they were not technically impressive, they were not the product of years of careful development and testing. They were simple, crude, and produced in quantities that made sophistication irrelevant. And that simplicity, that crude functionality, was itself a weapon, a demonstration of industrial capacity so vast that it could afford to be wasteful, so flexible that it could turn cargo trucks into artillery platforms on a whim. The psychological dimension went beyond the immediate terror of being targeted. German soldiers, particularly veterans who had served in multiple theaters, recognized that they were fighting an enemy who operated under fundamentally different constraints. The Wehrmacht was an army that had to carefully allocate resources, that had to make agonizing choices about which units to supply and which to starve, that had to cobble together improvised solutions to equipment shortages while watching its logistical chains collapse under the weight of Allied bombing and partisan attacks. The Americans seemed to have no such constraints. They had trucks to spare, so they mounted rockets on them. When those trucks were damaged or destroyed, more trucks arrived. When rocket ammunition ran low, supply convoys brought thousands more. The Germans were fighting a war of scarcity. The Americans were fighting a war of abundance. And abundance, German soldiers learned, was its own form of superiority. The truck became the symbol of this abundance, that simple, mass-produced vehicle that appeared in every American unit, that hauled everything from rations to artillery shells to wounded soldiers. The Germans had trucks too, but never enough of them, and many were requisitioned civilian vehicles ill-suited for military use or captured equipment from a dozen different nations, creating maintenance nightmares. American trucks were standardized, reliable, produced by the tens of thousands, and shipped across the Atlantic by the convoy load. That these same utilitarian vehicles could be casually repurposed as platforms for devastating rocket barrages seemed to epitomize the American way of war, practical, abundant, and unconcerned with military aesthetics or traditional doctrine. The crews who operated the truck-mounted rocket systems came from diverse backgrounds. Many were artillerymen, but others were reassigned from infantry units, from engineering companies, from anywhere the Army needed bodies who could read a map and calculate basic trajectory angles. Training was measured in days rather than months. The systems were designed to be operated by soldiers with minimal specialized skills. This was deliberate. American military doctrine prioritized ease of use and maintainability over performance optimization. A weapon system that only specially trained crews could operate was a weapon system that couldn't be deployed flexibly across multiple fronts. A weapon system that any reasonably competent soldier could learn to use in a few days could be everywhere at once. One veteran, Sergeant Michael O'Connell of the 2nd Armored Division, who served on a truck-mounted rocket team during the drive into Germany, recounted his experience in an oral history interview conducted in the 1990s. They pulled me off a supply truck and said, "You're artillery now." Gave me about 3 days of training, most of it just loading the rockets and understanding the safety protocols. The aiming? You pointed the truck in the general direction and elevated the rails to match the range card. It wasn't precision work. We'd get coordinates, drive to a position, set up, fire the whole load in maybe 45 seconds, then get the hell out before counter-battery fire arrived, which it usually didn't, because we'd be 5 kilometers away before the Germans even figured out where we'd fired from. The truck looked exactly like every other truck in the convoy. That was the beauty of it. Camouflage through conformity. We were invisible until we weren't, and then we were gone. The tactic O'Connell described, rapid deployment, mass fire, immediate displacement, was enabled entirely by the platform. A tracked, specialized rocket launcher required time to position, time to prepare, and time to withdraw. A truck could roll up, fire, and drive away using the same road network that supported the entire Allied advance. The logistics were seamless. The same supply trucks that brought food and ammunition could carry rockets. The same maintenance crews that serviced cargo vehicles could service rocket launchers. There was no separate logistical chain, no specialized supply requirements, no distinct maintenance pipeline. The truck-mounted systems integrated invisibly into the existing infrastructure of American mechanized warfare. German forces attempted to develop countermeasures, but found themselves thwarted by the very simplicity they were trying to counter. Counter-battery radar could track the rockets' trajectories back to their origin point, but by the time artillery could be directed to those coordinates, the launchers were long gone. Fighter bombers could strafe American convoys, but they couldn't distinguish rocket-equipped trucks from MOD, the thousands of other identical vehicles streaming toward the front. German intelligence tried to predict where these systems would be deployed, but their very flexibility made prediction impossible. They went wherever American commanders needed rapid, overwhelming firepower, which was everywhere. The Battle of the Bulge, that December 1944 offensive that had seemed so promising to the Wehrmacht, became a demonstration of how completely American material superiority could negate tactical advantages. German forces achieved surprise, penetrated deep into American lines, surrounded the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, and created genuine panic in Allied command structures. But the counterattack, when it came, was supported by every weapon system American industry could produce, including scores of truck-mounted rocket launchers that appeared from nowhere, saturated German positions, and vanished before effective response could be organized. The Germans had planned for a breakthrough based on tactical excellence and operational surprise. They had not planned for an enemy who could respond to crisis by simply throwing more material at the problem until the problem disappeared under a mountain of high explosives. Private diaries and letters from German soldiers during this period reveal a recurring theme, a kind of numb resignation in the face of American material power. One letter, intercepted by Allied censors in January 1945, was written by a Gefreiter named Hans Richter to his sister in Hamburg. He described an American rocket attack. They came at dawn, the trucks hidden in the mist. We did not even know they were there until the first rockets fell. In 30 seconds, perhaps less, they fired more explosives than our entire battalion possessed. Then they drove away as casually as if they had delivered milk. This is what we face now, an enemy who can afford to mount such weapons on vehicles meant for hauling bread. They have so much of everything that they have forgotten what scarcity means. How do we fight such abundance? With courage? With tactics? These things no longer matter when the enemy can erase your position with a casual gesture. Richter was killed 2 weeks later, not by rockets but by artillery fire during the Allied counteroffensive. His letter survived, filed away in intelligence archives, one voice among millions trying to articulate the experience of fighting a war that had already been decided by factories and shipyards and the vast industrial capacity of a nation half a world away. The technical specifications of the truck-mounted systems told their own story. The M8 rocket, the primary ammunition, weighed 38 pounds and carried a 4.3-pound high-explosive warhead. It was not particularly powerful by artillery standards. A 105mm howitzer shell carried more explosive, but 48 M8 rockets could be mounted on a single truck launcher, and all 48 could be fired in under a minute. The math was brutally simple. In the time it took a conventional artillery battery to fire a dozen shells, a truck-mounted rocket system could put 4 dozen projectiles downrange. And there were hundreds of these trucks scattered throughout American units from division level down to independent battalions. The aggregate firepower was staggering, and it could be delivered with a flexibility that conventional artillery could not match. American commanders learned to use the truck-mounted systems in concert with conventional artillery, combining the saturation effect of the rockets with the greater accuracy and sustained fire capability of howitzers. A typical fire mission might begin with rocket barrages to suppress enemy positions and destroy lighter fortifications, followed immediately by conventional artillery targeting specific coordinates, and concluded with infantry or armor assault while the enemy was still reeling. The Germans called this combination Feuerzauber, fire magic, though there was nothing magical about it. It was simply the application of overwhelming force made possible by industrial abundance and logistical competence. The truck itself, appearing again and again in German accounts, took on totemic significance. It was not just a vehicle, it was the physical embodiment of American economic power. German soldiers had been told, by their officers and by propaganda, that the Americans were soft, that they relied too much on machines, that German fighting spirit and tactical excellence would prevail. But machines, it turned out, mattered quite a lot. The truck that could become an artillery platform in hours, that could haul supplies across continents, that could be produced by the thousands and shipped overseas and maintained by crews with minimal training. This truck represented something that fighting spirit could not overcome. It represented systematic, organized, industrialized warfare on a scale that no European power could match. By early 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, the psychological impact of American rocket artillery had become a significant factor in Wehrmacht combat effectiveness. Intelligence reports from German units facing American forces noted increasing instances of panic and premature retreat when rocket barrages commenced. The shrieking sound of incoming rockets, distinct from conventional artillery, had become associated with the kind of overwhelming, inescapable firepower that no entrenchment could withstand. Units that might have held positions against conventional attack would break and run when the rockets arrived. The weapon had become as much psychological as physical, which was precisely what rocket artillery was meant to be. But what distinguished American rocket artillery from its Soviet or German equivalents was not the weapon itself. All rocket artillery had psychological impact, but the platform and the implications of that platform. Soviet Katyushas were fearsome, but they were recognizably military systems, purpose-built weapons that represented a significant investment of resources. German Nebelwerfer systems were the same. When these weapons appeared, they were events. Their presence meant a major attack was planned. Serious assets had been committed. American truck-mounted systems appeared and disappeared like ghosts. They required no special occasion, no particular justification. They were simply there, part of the ambient background of American military operations, as unremarkable as supply trucks or ambulances. This casualness was itself a message. We have so much material capacity that we can turn our cargo trucks into artillery platforms and think nothing of it. German engineers, examining captured examples and analyzing the systems from salvaged components, were struck by the simplicity. One post-war report, compiled by German scientists working for American intelligence during Operation Paperclip, analyzed the design philosophy. The American approach to rocket artillery represents a fundamental departure from European doctrine. Where we sought optimal performance through complex design and specialized manufacturing, The Americans achieved adequate performance through crude design and mass production. The rocket launchers themselves are barely more than metal tubes on frames. They could be fabricated in any machine shop. Yet their effectiveness in combat equals or exceeds our more sophisticated systems because they are deployed in far greater numbers with far more flexibility. This represents a strategic approach to weapons development that prioritizes adaptability and production scalability over technical optimization. It is, in many respects, the antithesis of German engineering philosophy, and it has proven devastatingly effective. This analysis, written by engineers who had spent the war developing weapons for the Reich, was essentially an epitaph for German military-industrial doctrine. The pursuit of technical perfection, of weapons that were optimized and refined and engineered to theoretical ideals, had produced remarkable machines, Tiger tanks, Me-262 jets, Type 26 U-boats, that could not be produced in sufficient quantities or sustained in the field because they were too complex, too resource-intensive, too demanding of an industrial base that was already overstretched. The Americans had built truck-mounted rocket launchers. The Germans had built masterpieces. The Americans had won. The end of the war in Europe came in May 1945, and among the millions of tons of military equipment left scattered across the continent were thousands of trucks, some equipped with rocket racks, most simply hauling supplies or troops or the displaced persons who were beginning the long journey home. The truck-mounted rocket systems, having served their purpose, were largely disassembled. The trucks returned to being trucks. The racks and rails were cut up for scrap or stored in depots. The weapon system, which had never been particularly glamorous or celebrated, faded from prominence. The glory went to the Sherman tanks, the B-17 bombers, the artillery pieces with names and traditions. The truck-mounted rocket launchers were footnotes in official histories, barely mentioned in popular accounts of the war. But to the German soldiers who had faced them, they remained unforgettable. Post-war memoirs and oral histories from Wehrmacht veterans return again and again to those trucks, to the cognitive dissonance of seeing such devastating firepower mounted on such ordinary vehicles. The image encapsulated their experience of fighting the United States, the sense of facing an enemy whose resources were so vast that they could afford to be casual with weapons of war, who could improvise solutions in days that would have taken Germany months to develop and produce, who won not through superior tactics or courage, but through sheer overwhelming abundance. One veteran, Colonel Friedrich Koch, who had commanded a Panzer Grenadier regiment during the Battle of the Bulge and survived to write his memoirs in the 1960s, devoted an entire chapter to American material superiority. He wrote, "We were told many lies during the war, but the greatest lie was that courage and skill could overcome industrial capacity. I watched my men, veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had faced the worst the Red Army could offer, break and run from American rocket attacks launched from cargo trucks. Not because they were cowards, they were not, but because they understood what those trucks represented. Every rocket that fell was one of millions. Every truck we destroyed was replaced by morning. We were fighting a nation that could turn its commercial vehicles into instruments of war without even slowing its commercial production. That was the true horror, not the weapons themselves, but the knowledge that behind every weapon stood factories that could produce 10 more, 20 more, 100 more. We never had a chance. The war was lost before we fired the first shot, lost in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh, lost in the shipyards and steel mills and assembly lines of a nation that had turned its entire economy into a weapon. The rocket trucks were just a symbol, but they were a perfect symbol. America came to Europe in trucks, and it crushed us beneath their wheels. This assessment, bitter and resigned, reflected the realization that came to many German military leaders in the war's final years. that they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern industrial warfare. They had planned for a conflict that would be decided by operational brilliance and tactical superiority, by the quality of individual weapons and the skill of individual soldiers. They had not planned for a war in which the deciding factor would be who could produce more trucks, more shells, more rockets, more of everything, and sustain that production for years, while simultaneously fighting on multiple continents. The truck-mounted rocket launchers were not superior weapons in any technical sense. They were superior only in that they existed in such numbers that quality became irrelevant. The American industrial machine that produced those trucks, that churned out millions of vehicles during the war years, did not stop with military victory. The factories that had built GMC cargo trucks retooled for commercial production. The workers who had assembled military vehicles returned to assembling civilian cars and trucks. The knowledge and experience gained during wartime production accelerated American automotive dominance in the post-war decades. The truck, which had served as a platform for weapons, returned to its original purpose, hauling goods, enabling commerce, facilitating the movement of people and material across vast distances. But the lesson it had taught on the battlefields of Europe remained. That American industrial capacity, when mobilized, could transform the mundane into the devastating, could turn commercial products into instruments of war, and could do so with a speed and scale that no adversary could match. The symbolism of the truck, that workmanlike, unpretentious vehicle, proved more enduring than the symbolism of more glamorous weapons. The B-17 bomber represented American technological sophistication and strategic vision. The Sherman tank represented mechanized mobility and armored power. But the truck represented something deeper and more fundamental. It represented the industrial democracy that undergirded American military power. The truck was a product of mass production, of assembly lines, of standardized parts and interchangeable components. It was the opposite of artisanal craftsmanship. It was democratic in the most literal sense, produced by the many for the use of the many, requiring no specialized skills to operate, no aristocratic tradition to employ effectively. And when that democratic, mass-produced vehicle could be turned into a platform for devastating firepower, it demonstrated that democracy itself, or at least the industrial system that democracy had created, could be weaponized. This realization troubled some American theorists, even as it heartened others. There was pride in the victory, certainly, and relief that the war had ended with the triumph of the Allied cause. But there was also recognition that the nature of warfare had fundamentally changed, that the factory was now as important as the battlefield, that future conflicts would be decided not by warriors, but by production managers and logistics officers and the vast machinery of industrial economy. The truck-mounted rocket launcher, crude and simple as it was, pointed toward a future in which war would be increasingly mechanized, industrialized, and removed from human scale. The romance of combat, such as it was, had been replaced by the arithmetic of production. German prisoners of war, transported to camps in the United States and put to work in various labor assignments, found themselves confronting this reality directly. They worked in fields alongside American agricultural machinery, in warehouses stocked with abundant goods, in proximity to factories and rail yards and the visible manifestations of industrial capacity. Many had never truly understood the scale of American economic power. The propaganda had told them America was weak, corrupted by luxury, incapable of sustaining a serious war effort. The reality was overwhelming. One former Wehrmacht soldier, Ernst Becker, who spent 2 years as a POW working on a farm in Iowa, wrote in his diary, "Today I saw more trucks in a single parking area than our entire division possessed. They sit idle because there is no immediate use for them. At home, such vehicles would be treasured, maintained obsessively, deployed only when absolutely necessary. Here they are surplus." This abundance explains everything. We fought rationing, and they fought with surplus. The outcome was never in doubt. This recognition that the war's outcome had been determined by industrial capacity rather than military prowess became a common theme in German post-war reflection. It was, in some ways, more comforting than acknowledging defeat on purely military terms. To lose because the enemy had more trucks, more resources, more industrial production was somehow less shameful than losing because of inferior tactics or courage. It allowed for a narrative in which German soldiers had fought well and bravely, but had been overwhelmed by material forces beyond their control. Whether this narrative was entirely accurate is debatable. The Wehrmacht had made numerous strategic and tactical errors independent of resource constraints, but the material disparity was real enough, and the truck-mounted rocket launchers were visible, tangible proof of that disparity. In the decades following the war, military historians and analysts studied the American approach to rocket artillery as a case study in adaptive innovation and resource optimization. The systems themselves were not preserved in significant numbers. They were too crude, too improvised, too lacking in the aesthetic appeal that leads to museum preservation. But their impact was studied and analyzed in war colleges and staff courses. They became examples of how military effectiveness could be achieved through unconventional means, how simplicity and abundance could triumph over sophistication and scarcity, how the industrial base of a nation could be more decisive than the courage of its soldiers. The truck, that symbol of American abundance and industrial democracy, continued to serve in conflicts throughout the 20th century and beyond. In Korea, in Vietnam, in the Middle East, American trucks hauled supplies and equipment and occasionally mounted weapon systems, demonstrating the same flexibility and pragmatism that had characterized their use in Europe. Other nations adopted similar approaches, mounting rocket launchers, anti-aircraft guns, and various weapons on commercial truck chassis, but the doctrine and philosophy remained distinctly American. Make it simple. Make it work. Make a lot of it. The German soldiers who had faced those rocket-equipped trucks in the Ardennes forest and in the fields of France and in the streets of German cities carried those memories to their graves. For some, it remained a source of bitterness, the sense of having fought honorably only to be crushed by impersonal industrial force. For others, it became a kind of acceptance, the recognition that they had been part of something larger than themselves, a historical transition from one mode of warfare to another, from an era when individual skill and courage mattered most to an era when production capacity and logistics determined outcomes. And for the Americans who had operated those systems, who had driven those trucks into position and unleashed their payloads and driven away, many carried their own complex feelings. Pride, certainly, in having contributed to victory, but also a kind of ambivalence about the nature of that contribution. There was no glory in driving a truck. There was no heroic narrative in bolting rocket racks to a cargo vehicle and firing in the general direction of the enemy. The work was mechanical, procedural, effective, but not inspiring. Yet it was precisely this unglamorous effectiveness that had won the war. The Americans had not tried to be heroes. They had tried to be sufficient in overwhelming numbers, and sufficiency had proven more powerful than heroism. The legacy of those truck-mounted rocket launchers extends beyond military history into the broader story of how the Second World War transformed American self-perception and global standing. The United States entered the war uncertain of its place in the world order, still emerging from the Depression, still debating the extent of its international commitments. It ended the war as an unquestioned superpower, and that transformation was built on demonstrations of industrial might like the truck-mounted rocket systems, unglamorous, practical, and utterly overwhelming. The message sent by those weapons was clear. America could take the mundane and make it deadly, could scale production to levels that other nations could not match and could sustain that production across oceans and years without faltering. That message shaped the entire post-war order. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe, was an extension of the same industrial capacity that had produced millions of trucks during the war. The Cold War competition with the Soviet Union was fundamentally a competition of industrial and economic systems. The American way of war, emphasizing material superiority, technological flexibility, and logistical excellence, became the model that other nations attempted to emulate or counter. And at the foundation of all of it was the recognition, learned in the East crucible of the Second World War, that abundance was its own form of power, that the capacity to produce was as important as the capacity to fight, and that victory in modern war went to those who could sustain the longest, produce the most, and maintain the logistical chains that connected factories to battlefields across global distances. The truck, in the end, was more than a vehicle. It was a philosophy made manifest. It was the embodiment of a way of thinking about war and resources and national power that emphasized pragmatism over perfection, quantity over quality, and systematic application of industrial capacity over individual brilliance. The Germans had built better tanks, better rifles, better artillery pieces in many cases. But the Americans had built more trucks, and those trucks had carried the supplies and hauled the equipment and mounted the weapons that ultimately made German superiority in individual systems irrelevant. The German soldier who had stood in the frozen Ardennes forest in December 1944, who had watched those trucks disappear into the mist after delivering their devastating payload, had glimpsed this truth even if he could not fully articulate it. He had seen in that brief moment the future of warfare, impersonal, industrial, decided not on the battlefield, but in the factories and shipyards and assembly lines thousands of miles distant. He had seen that courage and skill and tactical excellence, while still important, had become secondary to productive capacity and logistical competence. He had seen that his nation, for all its martial tradition and technical sophistication, had been defeated not by better soldiers, but by better trucks. And that knowledge, that the outcome of the greatest war in human history had been determined by something as prosaic as cargo vehicles and industrial production, was perhaps the most sobering lesson of all. It suggested that future wars would be won not by warriors, but by economies, not by generals, but by factory managers, not by tactical brilliance, but by sustained industrial output. The age of heroic warfare, if it had ever truly existed, was over. The age of industrial warfare had arrived, and its symbol was not a sword or a tank or a bomber, but a simple truck with rocket racks bolted to its bed, capable of delivering devastating firepower and then driving away to collect another load of supplies, utterly unremarkable and utterly unstoppable.